Ruby Rose.
Ruby, come on.
Ruby.
Ruby! I'm Ruby.
My name's Ruby. You can just call me Ruby.
Ruby's older sister.
Ruby.
Ruby, you're not the only Ruby girl is Ruby? Ruby? Ruby! Ruby, is that you? Ruby!
Hey, Ruby.
Ruby!
Ruby? Ruby! 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 Ruby!
Ruby Rose. Team Ruby. Ruby Rose.
Good morning, Team Ruby! Fearless leader Ruby, happy Team Ruby! Ruby, I'm Team Ruby.
Ruby. Ruby.
Ruby. Hey, Ruby. Ruby. I'm Ruby. Well, don't you worry, Ruby. Ruby. Don't worry, Ruby. Team Ruby is back together! Ruby's discard air fleet.
Ruby?
I'm Ruby. Hey, Ruby. 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 Oh, Ruby. 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 Ruby's put Ruby in a wagon.
Thank you for coming, Ruby. Ruby?
We met Ruby.
Ruby?
All right, Ruby.
Ruby! Ruby, leave your bag here. Come, Ruby! Ruby, I am a huntsman, Ruby.
I'm not like Ruby. Ruby? Where's Ruby? Ruby's safe.
Ruby is down there.
Ruby!
Ruby! Don't worry, Ruby.
Ruby?
Team Ruby.
We formed Team Ruby.
Team Ruby. Team Ruby is victorious.
Good to see you, Ruby.
Team Ruby.
Yeah, there's Ruby.
Greetings, Ruby Rose.
You can do it, Ruby! Ruby. Ruby. Hi, I'm
Ruby Rose. Team Ruby.
Ruby. I'll talk to you more soon, Ruby. Ruby! Is Ruby with you?
Ruby.
Ruby,
Ruby! What are you...
Have you heard from Ruby?
Ruby.
Ruby! Ruby!
Ruby!
You're special, Ruby.
Ruby.
Sometimes bad things just happen, Ruby.
There's more members of Juniper in this team than Ruby.
But we're helping Ruby with her. Ruby!
Ruby! Right!
Ruby?
Ruby! Ruby! What did I say? Why are people after Ruby?
Ruby's being hunted.
Of Team Ruby.
You and Ruby.
Ruby.
Ruby?
Ruby!
Ruby.
Team Ruby back together again. Your loving sister, Ruby Rose.
Yes, sir. Ruby Rose.
Is there a Ruby Rose here?
Keeping Ruby alive?
Ruby Rose has learned to harness her gift.
Ruby moves super fast. Ruby is somewhere in Mistral. Ruby was heading to Mistral. He promised me he'd watch out for Ruby before he left. That's my mom, and she could take us to Ruby.
I remember getting to know Ruby and thinking, this girl is the embodiment of purity.
Now your uncle has surely told Ruby and her friends.
I'll be fine once we could get her to take us to Ruby.
Hey, Ruby.
I couldn't have done it without Ruby wearing it down.
You wear a skirt, Ruby.
If Ruby sticks around? Oh, whatever gave you that idea, Ruby? Look, Ruby, I really don't want to talk about it, okay? Ruby's mom left too, and Ruby couldn't even talk yet.
Ruby.
He has Ruby.
Ruby!
Ruby, get up! Ruby!
Make sure they leave Ruby alive.
Well, what's the plan, Ruby?
Team Ruby won't leave your side for a second.
Team Ruby really made me realize something.
What's the plan, Ruby?
Ruby! Ruby?
Don't lie to him, Ruby.
We're not the only one with a grudge against Ruby!
Ruby. Ruby, it's okay.
Ruby?
Ruby.
You're not the only one who wants Ruby dead.
Ruby! Oh, thank you!
My name is Ruby Rose.
Ruby!
Look, Ruby. Ruby.
Ruby, we're in trouble.
Ruby, this isn't a game!
Ruby, move! Ruby!
Ruby, can you hear me?
Ruby, what are you doing? Ruby, stop.
Ruby!
Ruby. Ruby.
Ruby!
Ruby!
We can stop it!
Ruby.
Ruby? Ruby, hurry! Something...
Hey, Ruby. You did great out there today, kid.
You're Team Ruby.
We'll follow your lead, Ruby.
Hey. Ruby. Ruby, hiding things from Ironwood.
Ruby.
Hey, Ruby! Come check this out! Good morning, Team Ruby! Ruby? Ruby, come on! Ruby?
I trust Ruby.
Ruby! Transport's leaving! Ruby, are you there? Ruby!
There's also an alert out for Team Ruby's arrest.
What?
Ruby's right.
Ruby. Ruby.
Ruby's right. I'm going with Ruby.
Remnant is doomed, Ruby.
Thank you, Ruby. Do not worry. Ruby is capable of...
Ruby?
Ruby is barely more than a kid. Ruby is your sister.
Yeah. Ruby.
Hi. My name is Ruby Rose.
That's why you lost against Team Ruby.
I've always looked up to you, Ruby. And I still do. Ruby! 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 But I need you, Ruby! Ruby. Ruby, they're not called sure things.
Ruby! Stop me!
I will get you, Ruby Rose. What have Ruby and her teammates planned?
Ruby!
Ruby and the others have used the staff.
Ruby!
Oh, Neapolitan killed Ruby. And before Ruby and her teammates fell, they used the